The protest, a seemingly simple deed of making a statement or an action expressing objection to something. The height of a protest is a countless intricacies reaching a pinnacle. The passion, the emotion, the blood, the sweat, the tears, euphoria. To be in the middle of a crowd, chanting, screaming, singing, dancing, for something that they want so much, is to feel the rush of energy from thousands of people for a moment, becoming a single kind of humanity. Never mind the reason they are there, but it is an ecstasy. Then there are the material intricacies, masks of all shapes and sizes, stones, fences, cardboard, marker pens, helmets, fences, tents, all ad hoc things, all things taken from the street, and the gathering mess of all things needed to conduct the protest. And in our age of technology, it is about self-expression on the street and on the screen. The phone and the power of the handheld device is something quite wondrous, and what it proliferates is quite amazing. Demands become a series of hashtags. The call for people to join narrows to several clicks to create an event. Social media and technology has not only become the town crier, but has empowered ordinary people to do something beyond the individual because they have strength in numbers. The protest isn't new, but how it manifests is. What I witnessed as a photojournalist in Egypt, to Libya, to Syria, to Turkey, in Hong Kong, provided a broad look and a very varying look at the differences in people's knowledge about democracy and their desire for it. Mostly it was the youth who took to the streets with an unbridled spirit and fearless demeanor. In Egypt, thousands gathered in Tahrir Square for several weeks, demanding the fall of the Mubarak regime. They endured beatings, they endured arrests, but finally he fell. And it paved a way for democratic elections, but unfortunately hasn't turned out so well. In Libya, still thousands swelled into the hundreds of thousands when security forces violently cracked down on dissent. Libya had never known an elected government by the people, and they were forced to confront very quickly a reality in which they had to compensate for. In Syria, democracy was a word that was sometimes used, but rarely did people's real beliefs adhere to any system the West would call democracy. It precipitated into what is now a 4-year war with over 200,000 people dead. In Turkey, protests over the government's plans to build a shopping mall over a park weren't only protests about that. It was about greater social ills that had precipitated over time. In Hong Kong, thousands took to the streets demanding a change in the electoral law that would allow the people of Hong Kong to choose their own chief executive. It was the biggest challenge to Beijing since the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. In all of these protests I witnessed, there were similarities, but such different stories behind them. The demonstrators were often met with force, which only encouraged more people to join the fray. And yet all of these beginnings morphed into something with vastly different outcomes. I've been asked many times, why do people do it? Why do they take to the streets? What do they want? The act of protesting is something novel at first, exciting, when it is challenging authority especially. And when that dissipates, it is then about brotherhood and sisterhood, about unity and being a part of something that is much bigger than the individual, and the age-old idea that something can be changed. In these images, we can see the consequences of the spark of protest. and I focus here between Syria and Hong Kong to show the marked differences between the two and the consequences of both of them. In Syria, people remained, despite the fact that over half the population is displaced or refugees. It has become the most brutal war and has precipitated the most vital humanitarian crisis in as many years since the Second World War. Life continued, but at a normal that was relative to violence, to the regular bombings, to the snipers, kidnappings, the lack of basic social services, and the dramatic decline in the standard of living. Civilians became fighters from one day to the next. People prayed, they lived in their homes, and when they no longer had a home, moved on to the next or to a refugee camp. The growing desperation forced ideals to evolve from one of some semblance of democracy to a system that is best seen to just hold things together, to provide security and govern with religion that the majority of its citizens so devoutly believe in. Protests continued despite a raging conflict in the country. Funerals were held. Sometimes the dead were buried en masse. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, all grieved and watched as their country crumbled, brick by brick. And stone by stone, and mosque by mosque, and person by person. Until all the lights went out. What I witnessed in Syria is something so incomparable and so almost, it leaves me speechless in a way, because this was a protest about new beginnings, but has descended into this chaos that there is no resolve to. In Hong Kong, protests stalled. What began as instigation of civil disobedience, people wanting something better, a better system that they had known up until now, was essentially to them a Communist Party dictatorship. Living in Hong Kong, where I grew up, I never anticipated that young students would one day rise up against Beijing, demanding changes in the election system. To me, this picture represented so much of what the protests were about. A very young man with his goggles, people around him on their screens looking down, his umbrella inverted to protect from the tear gas and the pepper spray and the water cannons that the police were using. They wanted real democracy. But what did that mean to the Hong Kong people? There were debates in the street, something I'd never seen or witnessed before. People became politically active and politically minded. Many people slept in the streets. They endured the batons of the police. Some people were arrested. Many others were injured. And yet they continued for 2 months. The students who led the protests pitched tents in the heart of Hong Kong's financial district. They stood up to the police over and over again, and yet some of their slogans could be seen as being naive, but it was hard to dismiss. Their level of organization was astounding. They had tents pitched for psychological counseling. They had recycling stations and supplies of goggles and an arsenal of umbrellas and phone charging stations. In the end, after 2 months, this was swept away by the police. No concessions were made by the government in Beijing, but that didn't mean nothing had changed. In fact, there was a burgeoning new political generation led by the youth. What their parents had been reluctant to do, this generation was free from direct historical hindrances that allowed them to take to the streets. So at the crux of this all, the definition of democracy is having a representative government, representative of the people. And that's quite a simple notion when you think about it, really. But the simplicity is shattered when we consider that the ideas are as varied as the people who are a part of it, shaped by local customs, shaped by culture, and an idea for the system they think works best to better their futures. As a reporter, having witnessed several protests over many countries, one of the most outstanding things to me is that people themselves don't necessarily understand what democracy means. Maybe the protest itself is a broad definition for a kind of localized democracy that shouldn't be imposed, but actually understood. Thank you.